Welcome to our second Comms and Question webinar. My name is Jordan Ray. I'm a principal and senior narrative consultant with Curious Public, and I'll be moderating today's panel. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, especially if you're still recovering from Pride like I am. In honor of Pride Month, we've brought together experts in the 2S LGBTQ+ community who are leaders, strategists, communicators, and activists. They're going to help us explore corporate activism, pinkwashing, and how we can use our skills to persuade more people to become allies for our community. Our first panelist is Tyler Charlebois. Tyler is the director of the Centers of Innovation Network and Partnership Development at Humber. He brings 17 years of experience in the post-secondary education sector, supporting strategic partnership development, coordination, and execution. Tyler also has expertise in communications, marketing, and government relations from his work with former Premier Dalton Kinton. Thank you for being here, Tyler. Our next panelist is Lee Koo. Lee is the Vice President of Engagement for the Ontario Liberal Party's Executive Council. Lee has been an advocate for increased access to justice for vulnerable and newcomer communities, both in her current work as a realtor and as a former provincial candidate in the 2018 provincial election for Toronto Danforth, and as a senior advisor to Ontario's Ministries of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Indigenous Affairs, and Attorney General. Thanks for joining us, Lee. Our next panelist is Emma Wakelin. Emma is one of Canada's most sought-after campaign strategists and community activist. She brings to our panel a wealth of communications experience from her work as a senior advisor to cabinet ministers, premiers, MPs, and MPPs. Emma has played a key role in over 20 political campaigns at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels. And her exceptional organizational abilities and knack for fostering consensus and building trust in a highly competitive environment are a testament to her leadership and team building skills. Emma, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And our final panelist is Tatum Wilson. Not only is Tatum the CEO of the Children's Mental Health Ontario, but he brings to our discussion over 20 years of experience in multiple health and social policy environments, including government, academic health science centers, and advocacy organizations. His accomplishments include overseeing the development of Ontario's first comprehensive mental health and addiction strategy, and managing the development and implementation of Ontario's first poverty reduction strategy. Tatum, thank you for being here, and thank you again to all the panelists for being here. So I want to start our panel with a question for Emma. So many folks may be familiar with Dylan Mulvaney, who is a TikTok influencer and has developed quite a following for her advocacy for trans people in the US. And she was in the news a while back because of her partnership with Bud Light. That was a controversy that inflamed opinions on the right and on the left, but it was all because a big company wanted to sell beer to her audience. That's just one example, but pinkwashing like this happens every day. And when we think about our friends and colleagues and clients and family, many of them don't know how things like that affect our community when they happen. They just read the headlines. So Emma, can you help our audience understand what goes through your head when you see something like that happen?
Gosh, it's a great question. Thanks, Jordan. So that whole saga it comes at a time with unprecedented hate towards the trans community over the last year or a few years. It's sort of reached a fever peak over the last year with over 500, about 400 to 500 separate pieces of legislation targeting trans people across the United States and now even here in Canada and New Brunswick. So Dylan, who's just a wonderful bright light on social media and TikTok. She's a wonderful talent. And Bud Light, I don't even know if I would consider it a partnership. They released a can of beer with her likeness on it. and gave it to her. And of course, with the appeal trying to sell to her, of course, sell to her audience, which is quite large. And the bigots, of course, jumped on that and snowballed. The reality is, what goes through my mind is that the reality is that a trans person right now cannot be public without attracting some level of hate, whether it's just posting something on social media or sometimes just walking down the street. So when I saw that, it of course dug up a lot of safety issues. I was in New York City the weekend after it happened, and you could hear people being served Bud Light making comments and just wanting to shrink into the chair. So my thoughts are, when a corporation jumps to try to capitalize on the 2S LGBT community, they have to be aware of the complications that's going to come from that. And Bud Light just cut and run. They abandoned Dylan, and they suspended two of the marketing people that were responsible for that, and then have been silent ever since. So the big thing for me is it just highlights that corporations, they wield so much responsibility when they do things like this, and yet they're the first to cut and run.
Yeah, totally. A brand that big, who wants to try to, do something new to expand, their customer base, kind of has a responsibility in that case.
Well, and it just doesn't make any business sense, because it's the biggest corporate alcohol corporation in the world, and even the bigots and the morons who were boycotting Bud Light and moving to other brands, they were picking brands that were owned by the same company. So we're not dealing with geniuses here. We're not dealing with the smartest people. So of course, like Budweiser has the ability to change the temperature and change the channel of discussion, and they didn't. They shirked that responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in and just coming off of what Emma was just saying. I think that's the part that really frustrates me, is when a corporation, a business that's trying to sell to the community and capitalize on the wealth in the community, when they get pushback, no matter how big or small, if they cut bait, that truly shows us who they are. And it actually probably does them more harm to cut bait, because then what's it saying to the rest of their community who didn't have an issue and wasn't as vocal as maybe the few who were? And is that really who you want buying your product or representing your product? But then also, what does it say to your employees? Because I'm sure, as a company as big as they are and others, they've got people who are part of the broader spectrum of the community, and who now may be turned off or saying, is this an organization that mirrors my values? I thought they were doing something great. They did something, whether it was intentional or for profits, they made a decision and now they couldn't stick with it, right? And we've just seen this also with the NHL, right? Through some players' pushbacks, because a few of them pushed back saying, I won't wear this jersey, now they won't wear it at all. What's that doing to the broader community? What's that saying to all the work that has been done to try and make that sport more friendly and open and accepting? It's actually pushing everyone back into the closet.
Yeah, you can't just give up because it's hard.
Well, and Tyler, you bring up a great point, because when you talk about employees, I mean, let's be frank. And I know this from conversations with folks in the banking industry, that the reason that at least 4 of the big 5 banks in Canada are so strong with on pride and LGBT advocacy is because they know that when you have an employee base that is higher educated, you are drawing people who are more supportive of LGBT rights, but also you're drawing folks who are queer, and they're fighting for that talent, right? So big corporations can't afford. Forget that. I saw a study saying that the queer community has a $90 billion GDP in Canada alone, but you're competing now for talent that you're going to lose to more sensitive companies.
Yeah, we've got like a record tightness in the labor markets. So you really need to try and make sure you're getting everyone you can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in before we get to the next question? That actually might be a good segue into my question for Tatum, because Tatum, you're in a leadership role. And how do we help employees and stakeholders and other people who, we kind of have a responsibility to our relationship with, understand our perspective as part of the queer community? Like, how do you balance that with your responsibilities as leader? Like, how do you wear both of those hats?
So for me, and I just say up front, I know that this is a privilege that I am able to do for a number of reasons. But for me as a leader in an organization, and I've sort of been this way through most of my career, is just bringing my whole authentic self to work. And that means sometimes earlier than you might think is required. The first chance I get, I will say I have a husband, and it's just sort of like, so then it's out there. So here we go. And, like if someone asks, where do you live? I will just say, oh, my husband and I live along the Danforth. And then it just sort of, it's out there. But it's not only just about being authentic in that way, it's about being authentic as it compares to all the other ways in which you bring your whole self to work. And I always laugh, there's a bit of an example. So random, I play water polo. And I always used to think that if someone were to ever mention the game of water polo at work, I would of course say, oh, I play water polo. And yet I know a lot of people, again, for different reasons, whether it's internalized homophobia or whatever, if the subject of a partner comes up or a spouse or whatever, or they make an assumption, someone makes an assumption if you're a man that you're married to a woman, they don't, in that same way you would about anything else casual, you would bring it up. They sort of keep that quiet. And so that has always been my commitment to myself, is to just whenever I can, normalize the concept as much as I can. I also, my husband and I have a 3-year-old son, and I talk about him, not only because he's the most adorable child on the planet, but also just because I think it is, it's part of normalizing these kind of things. And so then that's sort of my own sort of bringing myself to work, but then also creating the space so that I don't ever make assumptions about anyone else at work. So, I use the word partner instead of like, husband or wife, or, your living situation, or your pronouns or anything like that. And so, and setting that tone both as a reminder to others to not make that assumption, I think is part of being a leader. And then, I've worked mostly, as I said, in social policy, and from a work perspective with stakeholders or anyone, it is always grounded in not being afraid to be the one to say, well, have you thought about this and the impact on the LGBT community? Or have you considered the equity sort of implications of a decision that's being made or proposed? So it's just a matter for me of just being, unafraid to bring all these complete pieces to the work that we do. I am fortunate enough, and I work in fields where even while our service delivery models may not achieve the equity goals that we want to have, the people who are working on it typically are of the same sort of similar mind. So I have not faced any pushback on it, but I do think, as we get deeper into things, whether it's about, anti-Black racism and those kind of things, there's a point at which people get a bit uncomfortable. But part of what I try and do is to create a space where people can safely ask questions if they're not sure, but also be willing to call people out if it is required. And sometimes that's done in a kind and supportive way, and sometimes it's done in a confrontational way if it warrants it. But just trying to keep people ready and willing and open to having these kind of conversations. And it's funny that you, just to sort of close, ask the question, and it's not a criticism of the question at all about wearing two hats, but the sort of short, pithy answer to that is that it isn't two hats. It's one hat that is just all me. And the more that we are able to create an environment where everyone can have that confidence, because I know that that's a privilege that I have, I think the better off we'll be. And I have had feedback from people, younger staff who, a year and a half into it have just said, that you so casually mention your husband has allowed them to feel safer in their work and their environment. So it's, so I just think of it as sort of, by being myself, I am bringing these values, as we all do, evolve the components that make up who we are into our work and into the work that we do.
That's a really great answer, Tatum, and there's so much to unpack there. There's like how you lead by doing, and also lead just by being yourself, being genuine and authentic. And also making that place that's safe for people to ask questions. I think sometimes it's easy for people in the queer community to sort of put up the defenses right away, which can drive people away. But those defenses exist for a good reason, because of decades of struggle and trauma. So it's important to allow people to come and support us. We kind of need to let them do it. Yeah. What do you think, Lee?
Well, I totally agree with Tatum. I mean, for me, especially like in my line of work as a realtor, I have it like an intro video which has signals to indicate that I am a gay person, and I try to also interject like my wife, my children, to just put it out there, and almost how you said, Tatum, I almost put it out super early, like just claim that space. It's a part of that labor, right? Like like how many people have to out themselves, but you are doing it to create that space so that people understand, oh, okay, without also warding off assumptions that people will make. So that is certainly something where if one feels comfortable enough to say, hey, my wife, my husband, my family, I think that just kind of changes the dynamics and allows folks to recognize I can't move with assumptions.
Yeah, that's very true. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, I was going to add, I don't think people on this call know me. I don't know if anyone's ever assumed right off the box when they met me that I was straight. I don't think I've had that since I was probably 5 years old. So, I walk into most settings and I work with many of our executives here at Humber College and never had that fear of not being myself. I never hid who I was. I don't think I actually could. Some might say a pink Barbie purse might fall out of my mouth sometimes when I speak. At least that's what I think I hear. So internally, that's what I hear. So I'm in a place, and my partner is in a different context. Many of his folks at work don't know that he is gay and that he's that we're in a relationship and that we are co-parenting a 10-year-old. And some cases they often think that he's a single dad, right? But that's because he lives in a different environment where he doesn't present overtly as I do that he is part of the community or that he is gay, and his workforce is not always as supportive, right? So whereas Tatum's created that space for employees and in places where he worked to sort of have people come up and be their authentic self, he's not in a place where he necessarily feels he can be his authentic self, which I see the impact of that every day on him when he comes home, right? In terms of what he feels is that pressure when the organization is saying things that don't necessarily align with their written values or what they say more publicly when he's in the other room, right? And because they don't know. So there's that other layer. So I think it's great that Tatum and others, that we need to make that space and make people feel comfortable to be who they are, whether that is, who they present to be, or because there's no way to hide it, or it's who they want to reveal themselves to be and be their authentic self. You have to create the space for both to be, because I think there's a large impact on our workforce when they truly can't, right? It's when we talk a lot about mental health, the mental health of not being able to be who you are at your workplace. You don't feel safe, you don't feel you'll be supported, or you may not have the career advancement if people knew, that there was a gay person amongst us.
Yeah, there's a ways to go still, isn't there?
Well, it's interesting because coming from the trans experience, for so many of us, we are visibly queer. We can't mask or mask is not the right word, but we can't be less visible because that's just who we are. And I know that. So on social media and that. Jordan, we talked earlier about my Facebook post. I try to be as open as possible about my experiences and struggles and successes. Probably, and I get comments of why do I share that so much? It's because I know that as a trans person who is involved in politics and involved in government relations, I have access to power, I have access to decision makers that 99.9% of trans people don't have. So I feel like there's a bit of a impetus on myself to be as visible as possible, so that I can help in some small way change the conversation about queer people. And
Yeah, that's actually a great segue to our next question, Emma, because there's a lot more work to be done on the persuasion side of things, right? And to be, present and in whatever capacity we're able to be. Earlier this month, the Human Rights Campaign in the US issued a national emergency for queer and trans people. The York Catholic School Board voted 6-4 not to fly the pride flag. Many municipalities across Ontario have refused to fly the pride flag. And on July 1st, it's no longer going to be mandatory for teachers and staff in New Brunswick to respect the chosen names and pronouns of children under 16 without their parents' consent. And it's going to be harder for trans kids to participate in sports that are consistent in a way that's consistent with their gender identity. And all of this is happening because of, there's bigots in the far right. Despite representing so few people, they've built an organized, well-funded grassroots movement that has enabled them to get their voices heard and influence politicians to do this kind of stuff. But that only works if the silent majority says, like, yeah, well, it doesn't affect me if they don't do anything about it. So as leaders and strategists and communicators, how do we persuade the silent majority to stand with us and be allies? I'm going to start with Lee.
It's a really great question. I think the greatest challenge we have is complacency. We've seen this happen in major epic moments, from the Holocaust, from all these moments that we look back and say, oh, we never want this to happen again. And, I've talked about that poem that always sticks in my mind about first they came for the socialists and I said nothing because it wasn't me. And then they came for the Jews. I said nothing because it wasn't me. And then when they came for me, there was no one else left to speak. And I remember very young in my career, I met someone who said, well, we got to stand up with each other. We're all minorities. And I think we need to put, like, for me, I'm a big believer. Part of my values is that we need to put differences aside for a common good. And I don't think people need to agree eye to eye on everything, but I think the basic tenet of respect, I'm not a trans person, but I respect the right for someone to choose what their identity is. I respect that someone can say, I would like to be called they, them, he, she, he, her. Oh, you know what I mean, right? But the most important thing is that we respect each other. And I just feel like those are common tenets that are common ground. And the complacency of, like, well, it doesn't impact me. We need to shift that thinking, because when we stop fighting, that's when we lose the battle. And when this minor group gain voice, like, how they always say the squeaky wheel gets the oil. If that's something we have to be mindful of. Let us raise our voices. But I also think something that's very important when I think about bystander intervention, you don't have to be in the direct, like, up there with like big placard or be a big advocate or activist. You can do something as simple as, how are you doing? Like, checking in with someone. Because if we have rules that say that people don't have to do this or that, how can we create safer spaces for someone to connect? Because I think all these things that are happening for me makes me feel it just makes my world feel a little bit smaller. And I think when the world feels a little bit smaller, you feel alone. And I think that's what these people want folks to feel like. And people aren't alone, because I know when I talk to, people in the school playground, when I talk to friends, there are a lot of people who care. And it is very easy from a two-dimensional screen to write nasty things, to hide behind pseudonyms, to hide behind fake, whatever images, and to just be nasty. But at the end of the day, there is a community out there. We need to find the courage. If it's not me, we still need to find a way to stand up for each other. And these, when a Muslim mosque is burnt and the community comes out and holds hands around a circle of community, that is powerful. So I'm a big believer that in all that we do, we need to be mindful of our actions. We need to stop, we need to listen, and we need to check in. So those are the things I think all of us can do, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, Lee. I think there are many ways to be an ally, so to speak, right? And I think, I like that point you brought up of, being an ally doesn't mean that you have to go to the protest and hold up a placard. If you do, great, that's excellent. We need people's voices, but it can be as simple as checking in with someone to see how they're doing, right? Like supporting someone who is fighting, or or taking care of people who are part of a vulnerable group, or forming relationships with other marginalized groups so that we're stronger together.
I think Lee brings up some very good points. We have to remember that the far right, and whether they're white nationalists or they're Christo-fascists, they're very well organized, and they're well funded because they have lots of money from some pretty insidious sources. But they're willing to compromise, and they're willing to. They're very Machiavellian, and they believe that the ends justify the means. On the progressive sides, and this is common whether it's the queer community or in other communities, we're very quick to judge each other on not doing the right thing, or we're not 100% pure in our ideology. And we have to stop that nonsense, because they are putting wedges in between each other. One of the big movements in the UK in the anti-trans movement is to try to put that wedge in the LGBT community. And the movement is the LGB Alliance. They're trying to put that wedge between T and the rest. And I can tell you, because Lee brought up that very famous poem, that once the T is gone, they're going to move on to the D. In fact, I'm seeing tweets now attacking bisexuals. And then once if the L and the G part of that acronym thinks that they can stand alone, it's ridiculous. So we have to stand together. That's the only way we're going to fight these folks, is if we're willing to put our infighting aside and stand together.
Yeah, it's going to take all of us to keep making this change.
George, is it okay? I don't know if you're calling us or.
Yeah, keep going. Yeah, please go ahead, Tatum.
So I agree with everything that has been said, particularly Lee and Emma and Jordan. If I might respectfully just though push back on the notion that, of course, we welcome the "how are you doing?" checking in. I want you to know that I'm okay, but I feel comfortable saying now that it is actually not enough. It is not okay to consider yourself, well, I've got gay friends. Well, you know what? They have a higher risk of suicide. They have like all these kind of things, right? And the thing that I always think about, I'm at an age now where I have friends and peers and my age group who have kids who are, entering their teenage years, is I always just think like you feel okay with a little bit of complacency now because you don't know that it's affected you, but you don't know that it might affect you in a way that could very deeply hurt and harm you or people you care about. And so I would just, I'm of two minds, because I love that the people that I've seen as I scroll through the list of the people that are on here, I know are allies and are even in the interest in being part of this conversation is great, but it's, like, again, to be going back to famous quotes, like none of us are free until all of us are free. And it will come for you if you do not play the part in helping to get things going for everyone. So again, I don't want to silence what you said in any way. It is a very reasonable and a logical thing, but it isn't really, it is time to act. And I can say, just back to the question about the workplace, when we had our son, our policies around parental leave were different. If you were a woman who had a baby, you got your pregnancy leave, and then if you were just the man or not, you got the parental leave. And of course, there's a recovery component, there's a medical component to the pregnancy leave, but the impact on our son was that he got 17 weeks less of access to one or both of his parents at home. And so what I appreciated is, my joke is that I asked for this about 2 weeks after George Floyd had been murdered. So they were just going to give me whatever it took. But I asked to get an approval for that leave. And what was important for me was to remind myself that they didn't do me a favor. They did what was their responsibility to make it a fair workplace. And it's that kind of like activism and openness to being activists in that way that I think is critical. It's that nothing less is tolerable.
You're so right, Tatum. And I think there's, speaking just for myself, there can be a tendency to not want to take up space and not want to ask for more for, for it's like, oh, well, I don't want to be that guy who's like, well, I need this, right? But to your point, it's what everyone else gets. We're only asking for the same treatment.
And if I can just add to the conversation, Jordan, I think what we're hearing from Emma and Tatum and even Lee is like we have to sustain this, right? We see when these big things happen, when big policy shifts happen, particularly more in the States of recent, right? Big changes come out, there's a big groundswell, people are upset, and then the news cycle changes and people just fall away, right? So the big allyship is there for like day 1, day 2 of something happening. And then who's there 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, right? It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that shows to those who are in positions of power and making these decisions that the group is not unified, it's not sustained, and it's very easy to start picking people off. And so we have to look at how we continue to fight. Tatum's quote, no one's free until we're all free. And that's the case. We all have to continue to keep fighting because we're stopping, right? We start, we support, and then it's like, okay, I got to go back to my regular life because that's not truly about me.
Yeah.
And so you're leaving it to those who are weakened to just continue to be taken over. And then they'll take the next one, right? So what's the B, right? And then it's the L, right? And then it's the G. And we all haven't, and we talked about this before, we all haven't, as an alphabet, supported each other the way that we should all the time. And I think we have to get, as much as the allies out there have to get better at being sustained in their support and allyship, the rest of the alphabet has to actually start supporting everyone, right? Because it is about picking us off one by one, because they see that we can, because we don't stick up, because it isn't me. Right.
And that goes back to what Lee said at the beginning, right? Like the comparison to the Holocaust is not hyperbole. It could happen, and in other places in the world it has happened.
The other thing I would like to say, just building on what Tatum's saying, it is definitely not enough to just say, hey, how are you doing? Are you okay? There is an important call to action, and to Tyler's point of sustainability, like don't just drop off after 3 weeks, right? And that is a part of what often happens. But I think it's also important to recognize that when a group is being attacked or being hurt, it is very hard for them to be thinking in a rational way because they're sort of in survival mode, right? And so I think in recognizing who has that privilege to speak up and to speak, like to say, hey, I deserve this. A lot of people may not feel comfortable. And I speak this as a Chinese woman of color, a gay Chinese woman of color. And I've often been one of the only women in executive level spaces feeling like, okay, I'm here. How can I maximize it without rocking the boat? Like there's all these things that go through my mind. And then I think, well, it's not fair, like for me to, and this is how I personally feel, not to like say, well, the way people are speaking here isn't quite appropriate for other people. Like we haven't thought about those people who aren't here at this table. Now, in fairness, it's difficult to put yourself in someone else's shoes when you have not walked in those shoes. And so I think recognizing our privilege is extremely important. How we utilize that privilege is extremely important. And so someone who maybe should do something may not be in that place. So I just kind of wanted to like speak to that point, because I think I know for myself, if I were to rock the boat and I were to lose my job, I would have the financial means to continue to be able to pay for my bills and to be able to pay for my home and not be worried that I will lose it. And I think that's important, because we have so many people who are struggling, and I don't know, I'm always mindful of that, right? So how do we encourage people to, you know, who are in a place where they can step up, who are in a place to be able to act, to do more? How do we do that? That's and sustain it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take a quick moment to remind all the folks who are listening that if you have a question for our panelists, please pop it in the chat and we'll try to get to it after we get through the next couple of questions here. I think it's, you know, coming back to sort of the theme of how do we, like, how big institutions aren't always trusted by the queer community, whether it's, you know, like big business or colleges and universities in the public sector. But Tyler, they also have like a really big public profile and big ad budgets and loud voices that they can use to be supportive. So how do they show, and we've talked a little bit about this, how do they show that they're genuine allies, even when there's kind of a built-in mistrust? And what does it look like when they get it right? What are the consequences of when they get it wrong?
Yeah, I think the first part to your question is, how do they show their genuine sort of allyship? Is Pride, you know, technically is celebrated for 1 month, and people change their logos and they raise a flag or multiple flags, and they do that, and they, you know, maybe have an activity or two for their employees. They march in the parade, and then we come to Canada Day here in Canada, and it's no longer Pride Month, right? And so I think when you look at allyship, it's how do organizations, corporations of any size show up the 11 other months of the year for their employees, for their customers, for their clients, whatever you want it to, you know, whatever industry you're in, it's how do they show up, be outside of Pride, right? What do their policies state? How do they treat their customers? How do they treat, you know, in non-Pride months, right? There's a TikTok that I watch, and she's a mother of, you know, she's got a gay and a lesbian child, and, you know, the straight child comes in and she's like, what do you want? Are you L? Are you G? Are you B? Are you no? Okay, come talk to me on July 4th, right? And it's just, it's a funny way to say it, but it's also, for me, I'm just looking at it being like, for 1 month, we get all this love and attention from corporations, probably because they want things from us, right? They want us to buy, they want us to spend money with them. But it's what happens after that. And it's not just our community. I think you can look at every other, when it's Black History Month and everything else, they show up, right? And then it's gone. And I think we just need more allies to actually start to live those values every day of the week, right? Every day of the year, because that's truly who we should be going to, right? And where you should be putting your support behind is those organizations, not just ones that change their logo for a month and then we'll change it back on the 1st. And so when they get it right, it's those organizations where we should be focusing. When we get it wrong, we see them, right? I mentioned NHL. We thought they were on, you know, sort of the right path, and now they've all, you know, tumbled back because some people don't want to do it. Now we'll see what it's like for those organizations. We'll see, you know, we saw some OHL teams, I think it was in Oshawa, the Oshawa General saying, you know, we're going to be wearing them, right? For us, this is something more than just because one person doesn't want to wear this jersey, right? They don't want to live the values. But I think we need people to live those values every day, because like the rest of the panel, I can't not be gay one day, right? Yeah. I'm gay every day, right? It's who I am. I can't put that in the closet. I can't turn it off.
Yeah, it's this is me, right? So what can people do? What can these institutions do to, like showing up 365 days a year, what does that look like?
I think for me, and I'll get the rest of the panel to also jump in. Like, I truly think it's your values. I think it's how you treat people every day, and what you're doing and what you're saying, right? It's how you communicate in a spirit of allyship. We talked about here when folks are being picked on, right? When other groups, when policy decisions are coming out, what are those organizations saying not in a Pride Month, right? And that's where you start to see truly who an organization is not during Pride. If something was to happen to our community, what are the organizations saying, right? Is Nike standing up in support of the trans community when bills are coming up and attacking the community? Or do they only do it during the month of June?
Well, and that's a great point. And I would put that not just on corporations, but also political parties. Every political party, well, with the exception of maybe the Conservatives, jumps to fly their flag and their banners and their candidates' banners on one Sunday per year in the Pride March. But where are they the other 364 days? Like, how many queer campaign managers does your party have? How many queer people are in your leadership roles? How many of your staff are queer? How many of your candidates, right? The Liberal Party, for one, it's the one that I had the most experience with. We've never had a trans legislator, whether it's at Queen's Park or on Parliament Hill. I see very, very few trans staff on Parliament Hill, and we're talking an organization between all the MPs and ministers that have probably about 1,000 or more staff. So where's the action? You know?
Yeah, it's and that's one of the best ways to make changes, that have someone who can give you the perspective of the community in a position of leadership, and have their voice at the table.
I also, if it's okay to go, I mean, one of the things, not only is it certainly important to see the vocal sort of, again, we've said activism in response to any issues that might come up in those other 11 months of the year. But I look at particularly the big corporations, but even large or small, like, what do their benefits packages look like? Do they provide funding for fertility treatment that is not only for straight couples who can't get pregnant, but for anyone to have kids in the way that they want to, right? Like there's those kind of practices and policies. How do they manage their pipeline of staff? How do they encourage staff engagement? Do they have a Pride community of practice? So, like, those are the kind of things that build trust for me. Or things like, do every one of the tellers at their bank know not to look at me and say, oh, can you get your wife to sign this? Or, whatever it is, right? Like, and if they do, they're fine with that feedback that they can't say that. So it's those kind of things for me that I, would actually love to look at in there. Where do they do their social responsibility donating to, or whatever it is? Like, those are there actually is quite an easy way to see who really the allies are. It's not just about if they happen to be caught in the moment and how do they react. It's about their lived practices that show that they really are allies in these times.
Yeah, totally. We've got a lot of communicators in the audience. We have a question from one of our Curious Public partners, Odds and Mug. They're asking, and Tyler knows how we do consultations. How do you do a consultation with the 2S LGBTQ plus community? What are some things to keep in mind when you're trying to understand that community and make sure you're representing them?
You're muted.
One thing, and I think we've chatted about this, when you're looking at engaging with the community, a lot of times people don't, in fear of saying the wrong thing, right? When you're, I used the wrong pronouns, right? Oh, I misgendered someone, just because you couldn't tell. And I met many people in our community who, when you're not doing it in a malicious way, when there's no ill intent, it's all about learning, right? We will educate you, but expect and support that you're actually having the conversation. So I think you actually have to be open to start that conversation and not be living in fear that you're going to say the wrong thing, Because I feel we often don't have those conversations. We don't consult the community because we fear we don't know it and we might make a misstep. That's been what I've, when I've, even myself, I'm part of the community and I have, used the wrong pronouns on someone before, right? Just because I read a name and it was wrong, right? And I felt horrible. They weren't upset. I didn't do it in a malicious way. There was no ill intent in it, right?
Mm-hmm. Emma, how do you, in that situation, how do you like gently but firmly like correct someone to make them feel like they can learn something, but not like they've completely screwed up?
Well, I think at the end of the day too, I'm less concerned about even teaching, that being a teaching moment. It's just a corrective moment. And I think far too many folks who are not trans who make a mistake, they allow themselves to feel guilt, and I can tell you 9 out of 10 times, if it's not a repeated or intentional mistake, we'll just correct you and let's move on. Let's not make a big thing about it. I would say if Jordan, I'm not saying that you ever did, but if you were to misgender me right now, I would just say, actually, it's she, her, and then let's move on. I don't want to hear a 20-minute explanation of why you made that mistake and how you'll never make it, because then you're drawing more attention to. So just correct and move on. I can tell you that I've never met a trans person who, and I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but in my experience, that is going to make a big deal out of that if you make a genuine effort to correct and move on. So it's about treating everyone with respect, right?
Yeah. See, Tatum and Lee have their mics unmuted. Go ahead, Tatum.
Sure. So I also think the other thing is that people can and should get used to sitting in discomfort. Like we have built out such a sort of protective nature of that I should never feel badly about myself, or I should never, have to dwell in making a mistake. And, I will give an example. In 2015 Pride, I think it was, there was a whole Black Lives Matter was the year that everything happened, whatever year that was, when they stopped the parade and everything. I was on the board of Pride Toronto that year, and at one event in the week leading up to the festival, there was a presentation from Black Lives Matter at the 519, and there was a whole bunch of people in the audience. And candidly, a lot of white people were sitting down in the seats, and there's a lot of Black people standing at the back. And someone on the stage stood up and said, why are all the Black people waiting at the back? This is an event for us and about us. I would like you to give them seats. And the talk in the group was, well, but I got here first, and I don't mean to be doing my weird white impression there, but like these people were saying like, oh, I whatever. And then I was even a bit like, well, that feels a bit odd. And then I was like, but this is like a microcosm of the kind of aggression that Black people face in their lives from all of our institutions every day, all the day. And for those 15 seconds, you can actually just think for a second and be like, oh, wait, this is, I can be okay in this, and I can take it as a learning moment. So that's one thing that I always think about, sort of in those corrective moments. It's not always corrective. It's okay to just be uncomfortable and acknowledge that there's a mistake, or even just not get it. Like, you don't have to have an answer for everything and be like, well, it does or it doesn't make sense, and this is good or it's bad. Just like sitting in that discomfort, I think, is really important. And then the other thing is, yeah, like on the intentions question, if someone says to me authentically with a genuine curiosity, how did you and your husband have your son? I will explain like right down to the science if they want to. But if someone says to me, well, who's the real dad? Then they get the other side of Tatum, and that isn't, and they deserve it, right? So I just think that there are these moments where your intentions, and we do collectively, right or wrong, have to bring people along when people are ready to be brought along. I think as a community, like I see that as part of my responsibility for me, not that everyone has to do it, but it's just another way that I try to think about assessing each situation one off and not treating everyone the same.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Someone said to me once that it's important to stir the pot because otherwise it gets all burnt and stuff on the bottom. So it's important to stir the pot and to be in discomfort, because otherwise you don't improve things. Go ahead, Lee.
Just building on what everyone has said, and especially the concept of sitting with discomfort, it's okay not to be right. right? And I think that people have this mind, I gotta get this right, I gotta get this right. And that pressure is a lot that it prevents us from listening and really hearing and observing. And I think empathy is an extremely important aspect. And so for all the communicators who are out there, we have our lived experience. We can't imagine what other people's lived experiences are. But if we take a moment to think, right? Because even that example that Tatum put, like if someone asks, oh, how did you conceive? And it can be very, is the timing right? Is an appropriate time? I get those questions where people are like, who carried who? And I'm like, that's like irrelevant, right? Like in people who are adopted, like even if we took that further, oh, you look like this person looks so much like you. And they're triggers. People can't know what those triggers are potentially, but we just need to all take a moment when we don't know to just think it out loud inside our heads, to think about the multiple effects could be, right? Like, and I think people are like, oh, I didn't know. But if you just blurt it out without thinking, it can be also really hurtful, right? And so that discomfort of just pause, let me think about what I'm asking, and just having a bit of empathy for the people who are in the room.
Yeah, that's so true. And you making it easy for people to be good, because I think most people at their core want to be good people.
Absolutely.
And so making it easy for them to do that helps them be good. So we've got 5 more minutes. I want to do one more rapid fire question, because we had a question earlier. Are there any companies that you guys can think of that like have really shown, either with internal practices or the way they communicate externally, that they're like true allies?
I can speak from a trans lens. Sephora has been a wonderful company to deal with as a trans person. They are, they have lessons for trans women who may not have grown up on how to use makeup, for instance. In fact, I went to Sephora and had a makeover, and she taught me everything, and I was able to, I thanked her on Twitter, and it turned into a big, I think it got over 1 million views at some point. And Sephora has always been very, very support, at least in my journey. I mean, I can only speak for the recent past or the last decade or so. No company's perfect, obviously, but I know Sephora's, and I hear and I see it in the diversity of their staff, that they seem to be a company that backs up their mission statement or their words.
Yeah. Any other best practice leaders we can think?
I think far from perfect, and they were dragged there a little bit, but Walt Disney is doing a pretty good job in Florida right now, taking on Ron DeSantis. And it is like, we all could take such lessons from that about like unapologetic, use your power to your advantage and on behalf of those who don't have it, and keep going. Like, and when you think you've gone far enough, keep going more, right? So again, Disney is a very complicated history and all that kind of stuff, but I think in this moment they are an example, unlike and I love hockey, I love sports, and I cannot believe what the NHL just did, and like that's the opposite of good. So but yeah, Disney from my perspective is doing a pretty good job right now.
And just say Disney was not necessarily driven there because of the profits, but it was driven there by their employee.
Yeah.
Right, because if you look just generally, you could look, they have their employee base is very LGBT, right? And so that was MK from an organization saying, well, do we want to alienate everyone who works for us, or a good chunk of the people who work for us and who do buy our product, right? And so that's a company where you actually start to look at is it just about profits, or is it truly about who you are? Because we were reflective of our internal audience to making sure we were supporting them. And we're fighting for them because we actually have a bigger voice, right, than an individual employee. Disney's voice is bigger in that fight, right, against Ron DeSantis. And I think they're doing a remarkable job, and they're turning it into other decisions and making him pay for that.
Yeah. Well, folks, that's all the time we have. I wish that I could talk with all of you forever about this. We'll have to do that on our own someday. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We've just popped in the chat. If you want to connect with our panelists, take a look at the chat. All of their contact information is there if you'd like to reach out to them. So thank you everyone so much for this really great conversation about leading by example, using empathy in our communications, and trying to get people used to the discomfort that comes when you stir the pot. Thank you all so much. Thanks again to our panelists, to Emma, Tatum, Tyler, and Lee. And thank you so much, everyone who's on watching, for joining us today. Thanks, and happy Pride.